Good evening and welcome to NycosRPG. I'm your host, Jonathan Albin, and we are going to be going over more of the process of how to create a fantasy world in around 80 days. The episode tonight will deal with wandering monsters and intentional encounters. It's going to be a hoot, but before we get to that, if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel here on Twitch, you get no commercials if you subscribe to the show. So that's a really big plus. In addition, if you are on YouTube and you subscribe, you are going to help us reach our next series of goals. We did something very amazing in the last 2 days. We achieved 2 of our goals, reaching 100 subscribers on YouTube. Yay! And also reaching over 8,000 views. So we are definitely on our way, and I have to thank all of you for that. But if you haven't yet, make sure you check out our Patreon program so you can find out how to become a participant in our weekend roleplay games on Discord. And for more information, of course, on Board Game Paradise, our local retailer, check that out as well at BoardGameParadise.com and on Facebook at Board Game Paradise. Alrighty, so let's get right into it, shall we? All right, so we've got 2 different topics we're going to be looking at. I've got one of them up here on the board, which is the concept of intentional encounters, and they are definitely a critical part of roleplay games, but almost as much as those, and in particular of interest to those who are creating new adventuring games, are the wandering encounters, the randomness that comes in that seems to make the stories hum along satisfactorily. And if you haven't got a real balance or a real comprehension of what these 2 terms mean, we're going to go over it in rather extensive detail, and I will be bringing you up to speed on both elements and how they juxtapose. The reason for doing this is that a lot of game masters are used to running material directly from a print product, and generally those have very little to do with the random factors. They have a list of encounters and a list of information that has to be gathered by the players over the period of time of the campaign, and there's very little room for the players to discover their local area, to get to understand what the biospheres are, what kind of creatures live in the area, and what are the likelihoods of running into these horrible monsters. And so many cases it goes down to a random factor, and this can really lead to a bogging down of your campaign, especially if you're using a combat slog heavy mechanism like Dungeons and Dragons, where an encounter that could take 5 minutes in real time ends up taking 45 minutes to an hour in game time, taking into account everybody's actions and everybody's turns and all of the action opportunities that can occur in a scene. So today we're going to be looking at how you can moderate that by having a clear understanding of the difference between intentional encounters and the wandering monsters. So it's technically up to a coin flip whether you want to cover wandering monsters first or intentional encounters. I'm going to go with the wandering monsters simply because they're up on the screen and I'm kind of a lazy fool. Anyway, so what is a wandering monster? Well, mechanically, it literally means that the beings, whatever they are, meander over an area, and generally speaking, the game master has a very clear idea of how he wants them to occur, but he doesn't know where or when, and so therefore he's using a random number generator, RNG, to determine when those encounters occur. But when you're going to build these random encounters, there are a lot of conditional environmental things that you might want to take into account that will modify or adjust those numbers. And from a play experience, you don't necessarily have to do any of this, but if you are really, truly building a world, if you're developing the locales, the climates, the environments, the biospheres, the predatory structure, and all of that, you definitely will want to take many of these into account. So we're going to start right at the top, the biosphere. If you are in a place where there is a lot of ice and snow, you're not going to find jungle creatures there, generally speaking. And if you do, it's going to be a rather extreme circumstance. So when you are building your Wandering Monsters list, you want to basically take into account the very climate and biosphere you are in. If you have a very moist and damp environment, again, you're not necessarily going to find a lot of dromedary camels or the more savanna-like creatures. So taking into account your biosphere is absolutely important. Beyond that, you also have to worry about the general environment. Is it a area where human population is active and travels around a lot? If so, that's going to reduce the amount of predatory travel. Even herbivore travel is going to be adjusted by the human population. And it doesn't even have to be that much. It can be the general environmental conditions. If you've been having seasonally dry weather, the idea of a pond turtle or a box turtle happening to be found wandering across the ground, it's less likely and will feel more like it's an intentional thing. So just realize that when you're creating your wandering mechanism, you want to make sure that you're taking into account all of the variables that might be in place when you build that list out in the first place, because there are certain things that simply wouldn't exist in a specific area other than by intent. Other things you might want to take into account: population density, how many people are around. Is there a lot of foot traffic? Are there a lot of children playing? Is there a lot of noise being developed by industry in the area? All of these factors of human endeavor, and of course this is crossing the line when we're talking about fantasy settings. It could be elven, dwarves, grim. The idea is that a denser population will lead to a lower random encounter density as well. Or your encounters will be with those very people. You know, the idea of a nomad traveling across a patch of land is greatly reduced if it is known to be a pathway through which nomads travel. If it's on a route between holy sites, perhaps it's going to result in pilgrims. Just realize that there's a weird dichotomy. A wandering monster list sometimes has to be more thought out and more considered than the actual intentional encounters, because with the intentional encounters, that's what you want to have happen. That's the things that you've created and checklisted into being. The random encounters are those things that should happen only by happenstance and are generally used for other purposes that we'll get to in a minute. But right now we're just looking at the building of this list. Perhaps you need to take into account the food chain environment. Are there plenty of sources of prey for the predators that you've chosen in the area? If it is a beast that generally runs down faster prey, do you have antelope and deer and perhaps kangaroo in the area that would give it justification to be there in the first place? And if not, what circumstances must be in existence for that predator to be in the area? Certainly it could be an apex predator, it could be something that even hunts people. But if so, if it's a high population density, why did it end up in this locale? Granted, it'd be a food-rich source, but then again, people aren't going to stick around if there's a predator that regularly wipes them out. All of these things kind of have to be taken into consideration, and we will do additional episodes about how to grind down this Wandering Monster list, perhaps, but I wanted to kind of cover all of the variables that you'd have to consider, because it is a rather large portion of many game masters' repertoire to have a stable Wandering Monster encounters list, especially if they are playing in a sandbox environment where they don't want to be the ones in control of when things happen. Also consider the content contact likelihood of certain beasts or beings, if you have a very skittish and very predation heavy creature, it is not going to run the risks of putting itself in harm's way if it can go other places and get to its prey. So with the awareness of the apex predator's hunting pattern, his food source diversity, are there enough species in the area to support that level of predator? And again, if not, why not? And if so, then so be it. Realize also that something that plays into this is the value of livestock. If a farmer has a very fertile herd of cattle and has many calves, it may not be problematic for him to lose one or two to a predator. Unlike a breeder who may specify that he's breeding racehorses and therefore every single foal matters to the very livelihood of that horseman. So those livestock valuations will also play into it, because if a livestock is highly valued, then the owners of that livestock are going to do what they can to drive off the predators. Perhaps you have a predator who enjoys the hunt, isn't quite as necessary a hunter. Maybe he's an opportunistic predator, in which case he may just simply be waiting around for the right place at the right time to grab a meal. So realizing all of these things, all of a sudden you're looking at your wandering monster list and you're thinking, well, how many of these are truly random encounters? If we're putting pressures on them in terms of biosphere, shouldn't these be more capricious in nature, more random in nature? To which I say, sure, but the rarity does have to play into it. If a species is rare, then the likelihood of running into it is also going to be rare. So even though you might have a fully stocked random encounters table, the individual odds of any given predator or prey to be found or encountered itself should be small. So a lot of time travels through those seemingly wild and random areas may not be so, only because the animals are clever enough, savvy enough, or have a wide enough hunting range that they aren't necessarily easy to encounter. Add to that simple things like if there's a hunting season. If there's a hunting season, the animal you're looking to run into simply isn't going to walk across your path. If you, granted, there's always that chance, but is that chance or is that intent? In addition to that, we also have to realize that wandering monster tables are in many cases merely a story time management tool for the game master. He has something he wants to have happen at a particular locale, so therefore he doesn't want you to engage with it even if it's a wandering encounter. Furthermore, it could be a matter of the storyteller adding additional road bumps, speed bumps in the story as a form of red herring in order to proliferate chances that you won't reach a certain objective by a certain time and therefore draw you off of your game as a group. Now, as a game master, I can honestly say that red herrings are one of my favorite fish, and we do a lot of red herring cultivation, but realize that the proliferation of red herrings does tend to play havoc with the actual objective and agenda of a group. Even if you're using an efficient game system like NycosRPG, the very number of possible red herrings needs to be monitored and maintained, and thereby you need to consider which of those you're adding onto your wandering monster tables as well. And then finally, despite all of the conditions that we're placing on your wandering monsters, there is always the possibility of an extenuating circumstance. In other words, the monster that the adventurers are pursuing happens to be drawn by a specific prey that the party members have captured. That could be an extenuating circumstance that actually intentionally drives what was a wandering encounter directly onto your intentional encounters list. Having said all of this, realizing that the wandering monster list of options is about as long as the list that I've provided here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13 to 15 encounters in a random table is going to provide a randomness of about 5 to 10% per, and therefore their statistical significance will be felt. If you build a wandering list that is less than a dozen or so encounters, you may find yourself duplicating an encounter over a period of, 1 or 2 sessions simply because you didn't provide enough variability. And so, which case your random list is no longer random and you're actually having to choose which of your encounters you're going to use. And that leads us to our second part of this experiment. Now, before we get there, do remember that this is NycosRPG, and we are creating a 12,000-year tale that's taken 50 years in the making. The system is skills-oriented, elegant in terms of speed of play, and intuitive in understanding. The players pursue their own progression. Game masters don't have anything to do with the direction that the players wish to advance. And while most of the sessions are dialogue driven and in the theater of the mind, the combat system is quite cinematic, leaving the players feel as if they just watched the scene on a big screen or were actually involved in a pitched battle in the very vicinity of the scene. Just realize that Nykos is not your clumsy old system, and that the real difference to playing with Nykos is fun. You're just going to have more of a great time. Don't forget to follow us and like us here and on YouTube. And let's get back to the show, shall we? Alrighty, so now we're going to switch gears here and talk about intentional encounters. Now, intended encounters are those places and times that the game master has a real intent for the players, and it has actions that he plans to have occur. And these can be as varied and as multitudinous as your random encounters. As a matter of fact, the list I have here is arguably exactly the same length of list as we were talking about with wandering encounters. But I want you to see how much they sort of parallel and yet are distinctly different. So for example, we talked about climate and dealing with the environment that the players find themselves in when they are involved with that random encounter. So is it a snowy time? Does it rain here a lot? Is there a lot of mud? These are all things that would be considered in a random encounter. But in this case, a weather event might be a specific situation. In other words, you're traveling in a temperate zone and suddenly you're hit by a whiteout snowstorm, blizzard for a day. That weather event then is actually an intended encounter because now they're having to deal with the fact that they are not set up for that weather variance. They weren't expecting it and they have to then resolve it. This can also be played into by, you call them acts of God, acts of fate, acts of destiny, wherein a situation, a meteor has crashed into the ground, or an angel has appeared, never seen before. All of these acts of randomness aren't really random if the game master's intent is behind them. So realize that you are affecting the very field of your random encounters by having intentional encounters fall amid them. And so it's really important to understand that the use of a random table where there is die rolling required and part of the process is not a place for a previously planned out encounter to occur if the randomness is still going to take effect. So that means that if you are affecting an active destiny occurrence and the players are engaging with that, you won't need to roll a random encounter for that evening. You won't have to choose to put the party at risk of some odd, unconscionable occurrence that might happen when you're actually putting them through what you actually intended as a game master. Now, all of you sandbox guys, and I know that I put your knickers in a twist when I say that an encounter can be intended. But even in a random environment, there are things that can occur on a periodic basis that have nothing to do with the player's intent, and therefore it's perfectly legitimate for you to put them or place them in a situation like the ones that are on this list, even though you are claiming to be a random sandboxy game master. Encounters are what we make them, and if you want there to be such an engagement, it's going to happen, so you might as well acknowledge and deal with that, and therefore not require both the random and the intentional to fall basically on top of each other. Now, I know there are game masters who really dig putting their players through their paces and embrace the idea of making a double challenge. But from my experience, players tend to appreciate the gravity of a situation greater when they feel that it really is something that is supposed to be handled. Another example of this is, yes, we talked about the frequency and availability of food sources, but what if there's been a massive exodus or migration for some reason? Perhaps an entire mountain range is on fire, or an enemy force has actually begun to use bombards and therefore is terrorizing the local population. These causes for migration and changes in population density are themselves encounter worthy because the players have to resolve what are they going to do for food when everybody in the area is also starving. Additionally, what if there's a plague or a disease, very much naturally occurring in many cases, but if you're going to draw attention to it in the form of a plague or of a major disease encounter, that can be dire enough that you don't have to add any additional stressors to it. Perhaps the reason for the animal exodus that we just talked about a minute ago, or even refugee exoduses from war zones, maybe there's been an intentional invasion and someone is driving these species forward, perhaps to discombobulate the adventurers or perhaps to reach some other fell purpose. The point here is that all intentional encounters don't mean a person's intent is behind it, just that you as a storyteller are holding to that idea of it being intentional. Perhaps there was something that was foretold, like the volcanic eruption of Pompeii. There were warning signs and there were signs in the heavens that suggested something bad was about to unfold. Perhaps these inciting events have been coming for a while and the players have been ignoring it. Having them unfold and trigger while the players are having to deal with it, chef's kiss. That's what we want. We want the players to realize that there is ramifications to their actions. Perhaps on another level, the adventurers are known by a villain to be traveling through an area, and therefore he has purposefully intercepted them at a location for the encounter. These are definitely intentional. You didn't wander up on the villain. He doesn't just happen to be wandering across the countryside with his entourage in tow. Maybe it's a monstrous incursion. Maybe an environmental change someplace else has driven this monster to change its hunting patterns and its hunting area. It could even be something as nefarious as criminal behavior. The idea that someone has robbed a stagecoach and now they're trying to get rid of the coach is a great example of an encounter that might seem random, but really is driven by an intent and an action that you wanted the players to engage with. Maybe there's somebody who's interfering with the mass migrations of other beings. If there, as I mentioned, a mountain range is on fire, then the animals that would normally frequent those areas are simply going to be moving to other areas, and perhaps somebody's intentionally interfering with that to make things even worse. Of course, the most strong of all of the intended encounters would be something that was mandated by the story point. If you have stated that when they get to Dixon County, they're going to have to deal with the county marshal, then maybe now they've reached Dixon County, so now it's time for that marshal's engagement. Well, that's great. Also realize that you can use your intended encounters as a form of hand-wavium to make red herring problems disappear. Perhaps you ameliorate the challenges that the players were trying to make for themselves by deciding to pursue a red herring by you simply resolving it in advance. And then, of course, there's the directed situation. And while it is I think the least savory option, in some cases, it is actually the best path forward. And that is when the players have run into a conundrum and they can't make a decision and they are varying all over the place and you need the situation to occur, go ahead and direct it. Now, if it's every week, every session, then yes, you might have an issue with the railroad mentality. But generally speaking, a directed situation is just simply maybe the players didn't catch the clue, or maybe you made it too obtuse, or maybe they have forgotten. Maybe some of the players weren't able to make it. For whatever reason, an intended encounter only means that it should happen. It doesn't indicate when. It doesn't say how. And the players therefore have options that make these two lists seem virtually the same. And I know many game masters, and myself included when I was a much younger person, simply used my wandering monster table and the interactions that occurred to drive forward the story week over week, because the random encounter was an encounter I would have put on an intentional encounter list if I would have thought of it. And so just realize that although there are blurring of the lines, your intended encounters should be metered so they're rhythmic in terms of the player beats to be able to feel it coming. Whereas your random encounters, they can stay as random as you want and arguably could become even more so if the items that they should run into are for some reason reduced in quantity. Alrighty, we have made it to the half hour and we got through both my lists. Thumbs up. If you, let me one more time go back over here to the commercial. We are, of course, talking about the growth of the NycosRPG channel and of the awareness of the NycosRPG toolbox. And if you want more information on that, check out our website at NycosRPG.com, where you can actually purchase the available products, including the Dark Shards pre-release version, the enhanced edition, and all the freebies that are there, such as the instant play, what's called fast play material, free for download, along with the persona packet, so you can just go to town building your personas now before you get a chance to play. And if you are interested in becoming a game master, why don't you go ahead and leave me a comment or reach out to me through Discord or YouTube or any place else at NycosRPG.com, and I'll be glad to at NycosRPG. and I'll be glad to assist you on getting started with whatever materials you have. And if you have a live stream channel and you want to do some collaborative work, feel free as well to reach out. I know I'm doing this late in the show, so most content creators have long since clicked off. But if you are a content creator and are willing to interact, let's coordinate some stuff in the future. I did want to also have a bit of a Game Master rant. So before we leave, I've got one more special segment for you. Alrighty, this is Game Master Soapbox. I'm Jonathan Albin, 50-year Game Master, and I have something I want to rant about. As a Game Master with a group of players that varies between 3 players on the low end all the way up to 17 to 20 players in a game session, I can tell you that the ability to command and control a group of players, not from the standpoint of mandate, I'm not referring to sandbox game mastering, but I'm referring to handling the alterations and changes that the players want to bring to the table, sometimes gets out of hand. And there has been a situation in the last couple of weeks where there's been some challenges with players in my group, and I want to talk about how we handle those situations and how the handling of those situations has longer form ramifications than you might think. And so this soapbox will eventually stand as a separate issue from the other videos, even though I'll leave it here on the long form. When you are a game master and you are hosting a group of players, there is always going to be some breakdown of communication between the game master, what his story themes, concepts are, and what the players determine to do with it. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's expected and anticipated and very much part of the process. But in particular, it becomes problematic when 1, 2, or more players decide that what they want to do in game is of greater importance or of higher impact or import than what the story as a group is doing. And I'm not wanting to be that guy who stands on the hill and dies for it, that the story is more important than the players, because I don't agree with that at all. But what I do want to say is that there are points when the number one rule in role-play games has to be invoked. And I don't like doing it, none of us do, but the fundamental rule of role-play games is that the final arbiter of all situations is the game master. It doesn't mean that the game master is always right, but it does mean that what the game master has determined to be the outcome must be the outcome, whether you like it or not. And again, I don't state that as a imperator game master who mandates what happens each week in my tables. As a matter of fact, my players will tell you that more fun is had when the things I want to have happen go wrong than any other time. But when these occurrences happen, and they always will, is several things that a game master really has to take into account. And I'm saying this more for my own benefit than anything else. Yes, I'm setting up as a game master's rant because it is something that does get under my skin. But here are the things you have to remember. First of all, first and foremost, it's a game. We are enjoying each other's company in an encounter or a situation where what each one of us has to say matters to the other, and we need to have a conversation. It can't be one person shouting the other over in either direction. And so that's important to remember. Hey there, Vinny. Welcome. Good to see you doing your homework and learning about RPGs at the same time. Well, this is going to be a good one. Haha! Because in this case, what we're talking about is what do you do when a player's decision is countermanded by every other player at the table. And it's a fun place to be, but it's also a dangerous place to be, because when we are dealing with other people's personalities. We're also dealing with their emotional condition, their current emotional baggage, if you will. But we're also dealing with their self valuation and their consideration of not only their own purpose or value, but also of that of their ideas. And so it is a dance. It is not a clear cut, do this one thing and you fix it. But there is something to be said about a mechanism of command and control. In other words, as you are hosting the game, your position as game master means you're the one who's going to be looked at for the final decision. And so you have to consider what that ramification will be and whether it's worth, having a conflict over. For most cases, I'm a yes and game master. In other words, the players want to do a thing, I'm going to find a way to let them and then modify the story accordingly. But there are times when such is not tenable in the time frame they've asked for, or not tenable in terms of applicability, and particularly when you're talking about the very concept of the imagination of the enjoined. Now, as you may recall in NycosRPG, the stipulation is that when you become a character in the game, you're not actually creating the character. Instead, you're aligning yourself with a being that already exists in the world, and therefore it has its own mind, its own decision-making process, and its own will. And the fact that it subsumes it to allow the player character to take primary positioning is actually a matter of trust in the case of the story and of the player, and is really kind of a interrelationship. So when a player decides on an action that his persona should take, it really fundamentally has to still fall within the parameters of what that persona might have access to. In other words, in the situation where the player is becoming untenable because he simply wants to do something that he thinks is fun, enjoyable, it's sort of like when we talked the other day about the Leroy Jenkins or the YOLO crowd. They do have things they want to have accomplished and want to see how the game rules will bear it out. But the game master has to be judicious with that because he can't just simply hammer them out of existence. He's got to weigh whether or not what they're asking is something that could have been discoverable from another course, or whether there is some personality leakage from the persona, from the player into the persona that would allow for it. In any case, the game master's real priority has to be keeping the group on an even keel, keeping the group moving forward towards the group's objectives, those situations that they have all agreed to and are therefore moving towards. And if a single player's action would be adversarial to that or a danger to that, the game master has to take real consideration about whether or not to even allow that activity. And sometimes that pushes the button too far. I think I've mentioned before I had a player for a while in the game. His name was Dave, and he was such a loose cannon that he wouldn't build a single character. He would build 8 or 10 at a time so that he could do the crazy thing, get eliminated in game, and simply roll back to another persona, sitting in the wings and waiting its turn for the primary being to assume room temperature. And this concept of open play, open environment, and the willingness to do things is outstanding. I never fault a player for being intuitive or creative or whatever. But what I unfortunately sometimes have to do is draw the line when that wish or that inclusion is going to cause historically more problems than it is worth. So, having said all of this in my rant about game session command and control, I guess the real point that I need to make is that when it comes down to it, the game master has to make the decisions for himself. he has to make them for the group, and he has to make them for the continuation of the game. Sometimes those ideas are not popular. Sometimes those ideas actually lead to frustration among the player base. But I wanted to bring this to light because as it's been a kind of a recent drumbeat, it's telling me that there's something going on in the player group that I have to address that I haven't yet. And so this is kind of my wake-up call to be more aware of what's going on within the group as a whole and try to restabilize the unstable and therefore get us back up online. Alrighty, so that rant took me 15 minutes of the time that I have allotted. So one final time, going back over here to our, what I call our commercial page. The big drive right now is subscriptions. We have 103 subscribers on the YouTube channel, and that is awesome. We have only a few subscribers here on Twitch, and what I really recommend is that if you have your Amazon Prime free subscription, why not put it towards your Nycos experience so that you don't have the problems with commercials any longer. If not, consider gifting it to someone you know that it would be interested in the lore of Nycos and would like to get to know more. If you are one of those and are looking for more secrets and insight, there are tons of Easter eggs at NycosRPG.info. That is my World Anvil account, and there are tons and tons of pages of material up there. They're all suitably juicy for the current iteration as time does cycle back on itself. And so even something that might be 2 or 3 iterations past might be absolutely pertinent to what's going on now. So do check that out, NycosRPG.info. And if you're looking for a copy of the games product, the Master Book pre-release is in pre-production right now. So that will be available in a couple of weeks at Board Games Paradise, the retail store that we work with in Redlands, California. So if you get a chance to go by there, you'll be able to see the property. And also we run games there on Monday nights and Tuesday nights, 6 p.m. until 10 p.m. And we'd love to have you join us. So I've now run the gamut on all of the promotions that I intended to do, and that I'm going to be bidding you adieu for the evening. I want to thank you for being with me. Thank you to our viewers who stick with us all the way through the episode. There will be the release of the clues for the giveaway contest tomorrow, so watch for those. I'm Jonathan Albin. This has been NycosRPG, and I will see you next time.